The coast of northern New Guinea lay under a sky that never cleared. Heavy clouds drifted in endless procession, dissolving into the ridges of jungle mountains that rose abruptly from the sea. The air itself seemed saturated with fatigue, salt, decay, and the slow pulse of war. Along the shoreline, American engineers and Australian scouts had spent weeks studying the tides, sketching currents on maps, smudged by humidity, preparing for a movement that few believed could succeed. Rubber boats were for rivers, they said, not the sea. The Japanese guns on the headland would tear them apart before dawn. But higher command, mindful of stalled progress along the main road, had already given its verdict. The flank had to be turned, and the impossible would have to suffice. The men assigned to the task were not specialists. They were drawn from infantry battalions that had fought through the steaming valleys of Leh and Salamaua, accustomed to mud, leeches, and invisible enemies. Now they were told they would go by sea, not in landing craft, but in inflatable boats carried by hand through mangrove swamps and launched under cover of night. In the dim light of a kerosene lantern, officers traced the coast on a faded Japanese chart, identifying the target, a garrison of roughly 200 entrenched troops occupying a coastal village, its approaches mined and wired, its communications linked to a larger network inland. Intelligence suggested they were weary, but not disorganized. They had survived months of bombardment and disease, clinging to the edge of an empire retreating step by step across the Pacific. The operation's rationale was simple. By striking from the sea where no landing was expected, the Allies could sever the supply trail feeding the Japanese inland positions. If the rubber boats reached shore unseen, the garrison would wake surrounded, its retreat cut off by forces advancing from the jungle. The success of this minor action would open the road north and shorten the campaign by weeks. Yet every calculation was balanced on uncertainty. The sea state, the strength of the current, the discipline of men who had never rowed before under fire. In the humid dusk, they tested their strange craft, black, flexible hulls inflated by hand pumps, light enough for 4 men to carry, heavy enough when loaded with rifles, ammunition, and rations for 3 days. The boats looked absurd, fragile, more suited to rescue drills than to war. Laughter came easily, sharp and nervous. Someone remarked that the Japanese would die of laughter before a single bullet was fired. Far offshore, the horizon glowed faintly where the sun had fallen, and beyond that line lay nothing but gray water and the unbroken monotony of waves. The plan called for silence. No engines, no radio transmissions. Navigation would depend on compasses, phosphorescent markers tied to oars, and the pale outline of the coastline glimpsed between patches of mist. At 2 a.m., the tide would begin to rise, carrying the flotilla toward the enemy position. Timing was everything. Too soon, and the boats would run aground; too late, and daylight would expose them to artillery. The final hours before departure stretched in unnatural stillness. Insects swarmed around dimmed lamps, their wings tapping like rain against canvas. Somewhere in the darkness, a generator coughed, then fell silent. Officers moved quietly among the assembled troops, checking that maps and signal flares were sealed in waterproof cases, that the rifles were wrapped against salt spray. In the distance, the surf hissed against unseen reefs, a steady, indifferent sound. Men smoked in silence, faces hidden beneath helmets, slick with sweat. Each minute felt suspended, the jungle holding its breath. Then, without ceremony, the order came. The rubber boats were lifted from their concealment and carried along a narrow trail toward the lagoon. The path was mud-slick, edged by mangroves whose roots tangled like veins beneath the water. Each step released the scent of rot and brine. When they reached the shore, the night was total, no moon, no wind, only the dim red glow of a covered flashlight guiding each team to its assigned launch point. The sea was a sheet of ink. Slowly, the first boat slid into the water, its hull folding against the waves before regaining shape. Oars dipped soundlessly. One by one, the others followed, forming a dark procession that crept away from land until the shoreline disappeared. They moved in silence for hours. The rhythm of the oars became mechanical, hypnotic. The men saw nothing but the backs of those ahead, shadows shifting against the phosphorescence, stirred by paddles. Every few minutes, a compass was checked, course corrected. The coastline remained invisible, though the faint smell of smoke sometimes drifted through the air, a reminder that the enemy's cook fires still burned somewhere beyond the black horizon. The boats advanced through this unseen world, each stroke an act of faith that the tide and the map were correct. By 3 a.m., rain began to fall, first as a mist, then as a solid curtain. Visibility vanished. The oarsmen rowed blind, relying on instinct and the muted commands of their section leaders. The rain drowned every sound but its own relentless drumming. Time lost meaning. Somewhere ahead, a flare would soon rise to mark the approach point, if the signal team on shore managed to light it without drawing attention. Until then, the flotilla drifted forward through the storm, small shapes swallowed by the immensity of sea and night. When the flare finally appeared, it was a pale star suspended above the horizon, faint, uncertain, yet unmistakable. The boats altered course, converging silently. They could now hear the surf against the target beach, a deep rhythmic crash echoing between cliffs. The shoreline resolved into a darker shadow against the gray dawn. The men tightened grips on their rifles, adjusted packs, waited for the final command that never came audibly, but passed through gesture alone. Then, as the first faint light of morning broke through the rain, the leading boat touched sand. The landing was not met with fire. The beach was deserted, strewn with debris driftwood, empty crates, the carcass of a small boat half buried in sand. The men disembarked quickly, dragging the rubber hulls beyond the reach of waves, forming a perimeter among the palms. Every sense strained for movement. Somewhere inland, a bird shrieked. The jungle stood silent. Then came the distant sound of a bell metal striking metal, rhythmic, deliberate. The Japanese garrison was awake. They had not expected an assault from the sea. Their trenches faced inland, their guns covering the approaches through the swamp. By the time they realized the beach itself was compromised, the Australians had already cut the communication line running along the coastal path. The enemy's reaction was confused, sporadic fire breaking from scattered positions. From the hills behind, the supporting battalion advanced through the jungle, closing the trap. The laughter that had once mocked the rubber boats was forgotten, replaced by the grim precision of men who understood the rarity of surprise in war. The first explosions echoed through the rain as mortars opened fire. The village burned within minutes, palm fronds collapsing into sheets of flame. Yet, amid the destruction, the fragility of the method remained clear. 2 boats had been lost to surf and current. Their crews never reached shore. Others were punctured by shrapnel, deflating into useless shapes that lay stranded on the sand. The operation was costly, improvised, barely sustainable. But it worked. The garrison, surrounded by dawn, found itself cut off from retreat, its strength dissolving beneath the coordinated assault. By noon, resistance ceased. Smoke drifted inland, mingling with the mist that never left the mountains. The sea, indifferent once more, erased the traces of the landing. What remained were the blackened shells of huts, the charred ribs of the rubber boats drying under a pale sun, and the silence of men who had accomplished what reason had dismissed as impossible. And somewhere, beyond the horizon, another coast waited, another garrison unprepared for the soundless arrival of war from the sea. By the time the last bursts of rifle fire faded, the rain had returned, washing the smoke into a gray curtain that hung low over the beach. The men who had come ashore in rubber boats now crouched among the charred remains of the huts, faces streaked with mud and ash. They had been awake for nearly 30 hours. The adrenaline of the landing had ebbed, replaced by a heavy stillness that was neither victory nor rest. Around them, the evidence of sudden violence lay scattered spent cartridges, torn uniforms, the metallic stench of cordite mingling with the scent of wet palm and burnt coconut oil. Beyond the perimeter, the jungle waited. It began abruptly, only a few yards beyond the last hut, a wall of green rising into mist. Somewhere within that labyrinth lay the remnants of the Japanese garrison, fragments of platoons that had escaped the first encirclement. They were few, but determined, trained to vanish into the terrain and fight until silence itself became the enemy. Intelligence officers believed perhaps 50 men had slipped inland. The order was clear: advance, locate, and neutralize. The main body would move north along the coastal track to link with the inland battalion advancing from the ridgeline. The rubber boats, now deflated and folded, would be carried as proof of success, symbols of an absurd gamble redeemed by precision and luck. The column formed under low clouds. Movement through the jungle was slow, measured, almost ceremonial. Each step sank into mud that clung to boots like wet cement. Leeches dropped from branches, invisible until the warmth of blood drew them out. The air vibrated with the droning of insects, a sound so constant it became a background to thought. Yet beneath the monotony lurked tension. Every rustle in the foliage could conceal a rifle barrel. Every patch of stillness might hide an ambush. The Japanese, though outnumbered, knew the terrain intimately. They had built dugouts along the ridges months earlier, linking them by narrow footpaths disguised beneath fallen leaves. As the Australians advanced, they found the traces of this invisible architecture: a trail of ration tins stamped with characters, a broken helmet half buried in roots, a signal wire cut neatly where it crossed a stream. The interpreter attached to the unit examined a captured document recovered from a corpse near the beach. It was a roster, handwritten, listing names under the emblem of a sunburst. At the bottom, a phrase repeated in careful brushstrokes: "Hold the coast, even if it means extinction." It was less an order than a prophecy. By mid-morning, the rain intensified. The trail turned into a flowing gutter, brown water surging around ankles. Maps became useless. Compass bearings shifted unpredictably under magnetic interference from iron deposits in the hills. Progress slowed to a crawl. The column divided into small patrols, each tasked with sweeping a sector of the jungle. The men moved with weapons raised, eyes scanning the undergrowth for movement. The silence became oppressive, broken only by the distant crack of a rifle or the hollow boom of a grenade detonating somewhere unseen. Then, near a bend in the track, marked by a fallen palm, they found the first Japanese position. It was not a fortress, merely a trench line cut into the slope, roofed with bamboo and earth. Abandoned cooking fires still smoldered, the ashes faintly warm. A single machine gun, its barrel clogged with mud, lay beside a stack of empty ammunition boxes. The defenders had fled deeper inland, taking their wounded. But the direction of their retreat was clear, toward the hills overlooking the bay. There, on a narrow plateau, They could hold out long enough to delay the Allied advance, and perhaps send a message to the command still operating far to the west. The Australians and Americans pressed on. Communication between units was fragile, carried by runners and shortwave sets whose signals were swallowed by the forest canopy. The sense of isolation grew. Men began to mark their routes with strips of cloth tied to branches, knowing how easily one could vanish in this endless sameness. Food ran low. The rations they had brought for 3 days had been soaked, the rice reduced to paste, the biscuits to powder. Still they advanced, step by step, through the rain and shadow, following the sound of distant firing as if pursuing an echo of the previous night's courage. At dusk they reached the base of the plateau. The slope was steep, cluttered with rock and twisted vines. Above, they could see faint movement figures shifting among sandbags, flashes of bayonets catching the last light. The Japanese had chosen their ground well. Direct assault was impossible until morning. The men dug shallow pits for shelter and waited in silence, listening to the rhythmic fall of rain on helmets. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the inland battalion was expected to close in from the opposite side, completing the encirclement. Until then, the beachhead force would hold position. Night in the New Guinea jungle was not dark so much as absolute. The air itself seemed to absorb light. Shapes dissolved into sound, the whisper of rain, the drip of water, the occasional creak of bamboo expanding with moisture. The men lay in their shallow holes, rifles cradled across chests, eyes open to a darkness that had no end. Some imagined they could still hear the sea, though it was miles away. Others counted the seconds between thunder and lightning, measuring distance as a form of reassurance. No one spoke. At 2 a.m. hours, a flare rose unexpectedly from the ridge. For a moment the jungle was illuminated, a frozen tableau of mud, trees, and human figures caught mid-motion. Then came the sharp crack of a rifle, the answering bursts of automatic fire, and the night erupted into chaos. The Japanese had launched a counterattack, small groups descending the slope under cover of storm and confusion. They carried bayonets fixed, grenades clutched like stones. The Australians fired blindly into the dark, the muzzle flashes revealing faces streaked with rain and fear. The fight was close, brutal, over in minutes. When silence returned, it was complete. The rain resumed as if nothing had happened. Dawn revealed the cost. Dozens of bodies lay scattered along the slope, indistinguishable in the mud. Among them, the remnants of the Japanese assault, their uniforms dark with rain and blood, their expressions fixed in a kind of serenity. They had fought with the determination of men for whom death was not defeat, but fulfillment. The Australians buried them where they fell, marking graves with bamboo crosses. There was no triumph in the act, only exhaustion and a muted respect that came from recognition of a shared ordeal. By midday, the inland battalion signaled contact. They had reached the upper ridge from the opposite direction, cutting off any remaining route of escape. The encirclement was complete. The surviving Japanese, estimated at less than 20, withdrew into caves along the cliff face, refusing surrender. Mortars were brought forward, their dull thuds echoing through the valleys. Smoke drifted upward, merging with the clouds. When the firing ceased, the ridge was silent. The operation that had begun as an experiment in desperation was over. The rubber boats lay folded at the rear, their fabric scarred by salt and shrapnel, symbols of an improbable victory. Reports were drafted in clinical language. Enemy garrison destroyed, coastal sector secured, Allied casualties light. Yet within those words lay the unrecorded truths, the faces glimpsed by lightning, the smell of rain on burned huts, the absurd courage of men paddling through darkness toward an unseen shore. By evening the sea was calm again. The beach where the landing had begun lay empty, the tide erasing the footprints of those who had come and gone. Seabirds circled overhead, their cries sharp against the wind. The war would move on, northward, toward new coasts and new defenses. But for those who had been there, the memory of that night, the soundless advance of rubber boats through rain and fear, would remain as the moment when the impossible became ordinary, and laughter gave way to silence. The ridge stood stripped of color. After the last shells, the rain had leached everything, earth, foliage, even blood, into a uniform shade of gray. Smoke still drifted from fissures where the mortars had struck, curling lazily into the mist that clung to the slopes. The air smelled of stone and decay, an odor that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Men moved slowly among the shattered trees, collecting rifles, stacking ammunition boxes, and marking positions for later retrieval. There was no sound except the creak of boots and the metallic click of spent cartridges being gathered in tins. The battle was over, but its echo lingered in every movement, as if the ridge itself resisted the idea of silence. From the summit, the sea could be seen faintly through the haze, a narrow band of pewter light beyond the jungle. Somewhere down there lay the beachhead, and farther still, the anchored supply barges waiting for the signal to approach. Between ridge and shore stretched a labyrinth of swamp and vine-choked ravine, where the dead of both armies now shared the same indifferent soil. The operation that had begun in secrecy was already fading into the routine of war. Secure, record, report, move on. Yet the men who had survived it carried something less tangible than orders, an awareness that the line between strategy and endurance was measured not in miles, but in hours without sleep. At the top of the ridge stood the remains of the Japanese command post. It had been a dugout reinforced with logs and sandbags, half collapsed from the bombardment. Inside, under layers of damp earth, lay the fragments of a radio set, coils of copper wire, shattered dials, and a transmitter still faintly warm to the touch when discovered. The operators had died where they sat, headphones fused by heat, their final message unfinished. A clerk from the signals section began cataloging the wreckage, brushing mud from a field notebook whose pages were filled with neat vertical script. Each line corresponded to coded coordinates and transmission times. When translated, the notes revealed a pattern of reports sent to a base farther west along the coast, an indication that the garrison, though isolated, had remained part of a wider defensive chain. The intelligence officers gathered around the find as if it were an archaeological relic. The implications were immediate. If the Japanese still maintained contact, other outposts would soon learn of the landing. Surprise, the one currency that had purchased success, was already devalued. Orders went out for the engineers to repair the captured set. They worked under tarpaulin in the constant drizzle, stripping insulation from scavenged wires, replacing vacuum tubes with spares carried from the beach. By nightfall, a faint signal crackled through the static, a pulse of Morse, thin but distinct. It was not from the enemy, but from the Allied forward command, relayed through layers of interference. The ridge was alive with unseen electricity, invisible lines of communication threading through the rain. Meanwhile, burial details continued their work. Graves were dug along a narrow terrace facing east, the ground too rocky for depth. Helmets were placed at the heads, identification tags tied with wire. The Japanese dead were buried separately, though with the same rough precision. Chaplains recited words that dissolved into the sound of water trickling down the slope. For a moment, the ridge seemed to hold its breath. Then the rain resumed, filling the fresh mounds until the distinction between them blurred. At dusk, the men gathered near the repaired radio, listening to fragments of news transmitted from the mainland. Weather forecasts, casualty lists, brief bulletins about operations far beyond their comprehension. The voice of the war, filtered through static, felt remote, almost fictional. To those who had rowed through the storm in rubber boats and climbed this ridge through mud and fire, the larger narrative of victory and advance seemed abstract. They lived instead in the narrow rhythm of survival dry socks, hot tea, the next hill to secure. Yet headquarters saw the action differently. Reports described the landing as a model of innovation, proof that flexibility could defeat entrenched resistance. Commendations were drafted. Photographs of the rubber boats were requested for propaganda use. A correspondent arrived by seaplane 2 days later, his uniform crisp, his notebook dry. He interviewed officers under makeshift awnings, sketching the ridge as if it were a triumphal monument rather than a slope of soaked graves. The men watched without comment. They understood that war required its own narratives of clarity, even when the truth was only mud. The Japanese survivors, few in number, were still being hunted in the gullies below. Occasional bursts of gunfire drifted upward, muffled by vegetation. At night, flares illuminated sections of the forest where movement had been sighted. Sometimes nothing followed. Sometimes a single figure was found at dawn, lying beside a grenade whose pin was already pulled. These encounters ceased gradually, like the fading of an echo. By the 5th day, the ridge was declared secure. With security came monotony. Engineers cut a track down to the beach, laying corduroy over the worst sections so that mules and carriers could move supplies inland. The rain never stopped. Food spoiled faster than it could be distributed. Radios corroded, maps disintegrated, tempers frayed. The jungle reclaimed everything it touched. Yet amid the decay, life reasserted itself in quiet ways. Small fires burned each evening for cooking. Letters were written on damp paper and sealed in tins. A stray dog, left by some earlier patrol, followed the men from camp to camp, sleeping beside the radio tent as if guarding its secrets. From captured documents, intelligence pieced together the last weeks of the Japanese garrison. They had known of their isolation, had even anticipated encirclement. Their final transmissions contained not requests for rescue, but weather data and coordinates of Allied shipping cited offshore evidence of duty carried to the end. The irony was inescapable. The same discipline that had doomed them was admired by those who had destroyed them. In official summaries, the phrase "fanatical resistance" appeared repeatedly, a convenient label for courage expressed in a language the victors could not translate. When the relief convoy arrived from the south, bringing fresh troops and medical supplies, the original landing force was ordered to withdraw to rest areas near the coast. The ascent to the ridge was retraced in reverse, but the descent felt longer. The path had changed under rain. Landslides had erased landmarks. At every bend, the jungle seemed to close behind them, sealing the memory of the fight as completely as soil covers a grave. By the time they reached the beach, the tide was out, revealing a broad stretch of mudflats where the first rubber boats had landed weeks earlier. Most of the boats had been patched and reused, their black surfaces now streaked with salt and mildew. They were hoisted once more, deflated and lashed to supply crates, ready to be shipped to the next sector. None of the men laughed this time. The sight of the pliant material, once ridiculed, now revered, carried a weight of meaning that no ceremony could express. It represented the fragile line between plan and improvisation, between the absurd and the possible. As night fell, the ridge faded into shadow behind them. The radio still crackled, relaying coordinates for future operations farther north, where other garrisons waited behind other beaches. The voice on the air was steady, impersonal, unbroken by the noise of surf or rain. For those listening, it was the sound of continuity, the assurance that what had happened here would soon be repeated elsewhere under different clouds, with different names. The sea, indifferent and eternal, would bear them forward again, and somewhere in the dark another shore would wake to the whisper of oars. The map of New Guinea on the operations table looked like a torn wing. Rivers radiated from the mountains in pale threads, roads vanished into the green void, and the coastline curved northward toward names already half forgotten: Finschhafen, Sidor, Madang. What had begun as a small coastal experiment was now a model for the whole advance. Reports from the ridge were copied, summarized, and dispatched to headquarters at Port Moresby, where planners studied them under the glare of hurricane lamps. The language of the documents was impersonal, but their implications were vast. Light craft and stealth could succeed where armor and tonnage failed. The next phase would extend that principle from a few miles of jungle to hundreds. Command decisions in New Guinea were made between bursts of static. Radios linked airfields, convoys, and forward units across distances that geography seemed to resist. The Supreme Allied Command sought rhythm in chaos, coordinating infantry, air, and naval arms against a network of Japanese garrisons still entrenched along the coast. Each enemy strongpoint was both obstacle and warning. Defeat one too slowly, and the next would be reinforced before the victory was complete. Speed became doctrine. Where terrain denied roads, the sea would serve as the highway. Where harbors were mined or destroyed, the rubber boats and their heavier cousins, amphibious tractors and folding craft, would bridge the gap. At Milne Bay, warehouses filled with canvas, outboard motors, and petrol drums marked the transformation of improvisation into system. Engineers calculated tidal ranges, meteorologists plotted wind drift, and supply officers traced chains of delivery from Brisbane to the front. The rubber boats that once seemed laughable were now requisitioned in the hundreds, redesigned with thicker skins and detachable keels. Men who had mocked them spoke of shore-to-shore tactics and silent landings. What had been desperation was becoming method. The Japanese command, aware of the pattern, attempted to consolidate. Aerial photographs revealed new trenches near coastal villages, anti-boat obstacles hammered into reefs, and camouflaged batteries overlooking probable landing zones. But the Empire's arteries were failing. Allied aircraft ruled the sky, cutting supply convoys to pieces before they reached port. Hunger and malaria eroded garrisons faster than bombardment. Still, the defenders fought with the same grim certainty that had marked the Ridge campaign, each outpost buying time for the next, each defeat recorded as honorable delay. From above, the New Guinea coast looked deceptively peaceful, a vast mosaic of jungle and lagoon where sunlight struck the sea like molten metal. Yet every inlet concealed a campaign. By early 1944, the Allied advance had become a sequence of overlapping thrusts, airborne, naval, and amphibious. Each leap designed to bypass heavy concentrations and seize airfields for the next leap northward toward the Philippines. Historians would later call it island hopping. But to those involved, it felt more like crawling through rain and fever toward an invisible line on a wall map. The rubber boat concept evolved with the strategy. Special service units trained to launch night raids on isolated supply dumps, slipping through surf so quietly that sentries sometimes found the prints of bare feet in sand hours after the attackers had gone. These small strikes multiplied uncertainty, convincing the Japanese that the sea itself had turned against them. Radio intercepts recorded confused reports. Enemy landed in great strength, when in truth only 20 men had come ashore. The psychological weight of unpredictability began to do what artillery could not fracture: cohesion. At Allied headquarters near Leh, coordination between armies and air forces reached a fragile maturity. Staff officers worked through nights that smelled of kerosene and sweat, translating field requests into coded signals. They studied weather charts scrawled in pencil, determining which coves would permit a landing before dawn. Behind them, walls were pinned with reconnaissance photographs, black and white ghosts of villages, reefs, and clouds. In that grayscale world, human life appeared only as dots and shadows, yet decisions made there would decide who lived on the ground below. The northern push gathered momentum. Task forces leapfrogged from headland to headland, securing each in turn before the Japanese could regroup. In the air, long-range bombers flattened runways and fuel dumps. At sea, destroyers prowled offshore, their guns silent until the faint light of morning revealed targets. And always, before the first shell, came the quiet arrival of the rubber boats. They slid from landing ships like seeds cast by wind, spreading across the surf in disciplined lines. The men who paddled them no longer laughed. They had seen too often how a single mistake could overturn boat and plan alike. But they trusted the method because it worked, and because war allowed no room for disbelief. As the campaign advanced northward, logistics replaced heroism as the measure of success. Ton after ton of fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies moved along the coast on barges escorted by patrol craft. Engineers hacked airstrips from jungle within days, and every captured ridge became a radio relay. The invisible infrastructure of war grew: dense wires, pipes, depots, binding the wilderness to the machinery of an empire in reverse. From Port Moresby to Hollandia, the line of communication pulsed like an electric current. Somewhere in that current, buried among codes and schedules, was the memory of the first landing that had made it possible. The Japanese retreat was orderly in appearance but desperate in reality. Reports intercepted from their own transmitters described units reduced to a third of their strength, fighting not for territory, but for delay. Malnutrition replaced ammunition as the limiting factor, yet discipline held. The defenders dug in along riverbanks, transforming every crossing into a miniature war. Allied casualties mounted not in spectacular battles, but in the slow attrition of movement disease, exhaustion, and terrain, exacting a price higher than bullets. By late 1944, the northern coast was a corridor of motion. Convoys of small craft moved by night, their running lights blacked out. Offshore, the broader war was turning. American fleets surged toward the Philippines, and New Guinea receded into the background of a larger campaign. But for those still there, the jungle remained absolute. Orders spoke of objectives and timetables. The land answered with mud and distance. Headquarters called the operation a continuous advance. The men on the ground called it walking north forever. From the perspective of command, the success was undeniable. Lines on maps shifted weekly, and communiques announced towns liberated that had long since been abandoned. Yet even in official reports, a strange humility surfaced. The staff officers who had once doubted the worth of rubber boats now wrote with measured respect about the adaptability of personnel in maritime infiltration. They understood that technology alone had not moved the front. It was the willingness to improvise, to trust silence over noise, that had redrawn the coast. When the monsoon returned, the advance slowed. Airfields flooded, supply dumps molded, and men grew thin from fever. Still, the tide of war had turned irreversibly. Behind the damp curtains of rain, preparations began for the next leap westward toward Morotai and beyond. Strategists traced arcs on new charts, the same gestures repeated under cleaner light. The pattern of landings, advances, and encirclements would continue until the sea itself ran out of islands. At dusk, the northern sky cleared briefly, revealing a sunset of copper and smoke. On a bluff above the newest airstrip, an officer of the original landing force stood watching the convoys depart. Below him, the surf glowed faintly around a cluster of inflated boats waiting for night. Their black forms looked fragile against the magnitude of the ocean, yet they had carried armies, altered maps, and turned laughter into faith. The campaign would move on without them, but their shadow would remain in every plan drawn thereafter, a reminder that strategy often begins not with strength, but with audacity measured against disbelief. The final days of the northern push were marked not by fireworks but by absence. The jungle, ever patient, reclaimed the edges of the paths, the broken huts, and the flattened airstrips. Rainfall persisted, relentless and indifferent, filling every depression with brown water, washing away tracks, and softening the graves of both Allied and Japanese alike. The men who had paddled the first rubber boats now moved inland, tracing the coastline in reversed arcs, following orders that seemed as infinite as the horizon. The air smelled of wet earth and salt, of diesel and decay, a permanence that outlasted strategy. Supply convoys wound through mud and tide, carrying provisions north, then west, threading the thin corridors between mountains and sea. Engineers repaired collapsed bridges, carved corduroy paths across marshes, and patched airfields whose runways were little more than compacted jungle. The work was painstaking, invisible to those who measured success only in towns seized or garrisons destroyed. Yet without it, no advance could survive. The meticulous architecture of war, often unrecorded in dispatches, became the backbone of the campaign. The original landing force returned along the coast in silence. Their rubber boats were folded and stowed, worn and punctured, remnants of the improbable beginning of the campaign. No one spoke of their first night ashore, of the dark water swallowing outlines, or the faint, distant glow of Japanese flares. Laughter had long vanished, replaced by the quiet endurance of men who understood the weight of survival. Only the ocean knew the truth of their crossing, indifferent to the bravery it had borne. The Japanese garrisons had vanished or surrendered, those that remained were cut off, diminished by hunger and disease, and increasingly isolated as the tide of Allied movement carried forward. Intercepted messages reflected frustration, resignation, and the precise stoicism that had characterized the campaign from the start. For the Allied commanders, this silence was confirmation. Their strategy worked not by annihilation, but by outmaneuvering an enemy whose discipline could not overcome logistical isolation. Every silent garrison left behind was both a tactical victory and a moral reminder of the slow, grinding nature of the war. Back at Port Moresby, reports of the operation circulated in dry, clipped language. Objective achieved. Northern coastal sector secured. Casualties minimal. Enemy strength neutralized. But in the margins, the words of officers hinted at the intangible lessons learned. The value of small, agile units operating quietly in darkness, the effectiveness of rubber craft when combined with intelligence and timing, the courage of men navigating unfamiliar terrain under conditions no human had reason to expect. Historians would later codify these observations as doctrine, yet at the time they existed only as experience, inscribed in fatigue-lined faces and calloused hands. For the men, memory became a quieter adversary than the jungle. Nights were spent in damp tents, listening to the pulse of rainfall, counting the seconds between thunder and lightning, recalling the shapes of mangroves and the flash of bayonets in misted moonlight. Some dreamed of home. Others could not differentiate between dreams and memory, the rhythm of oars in black water repeating in sleep. The psychological toll of extended isolation, exposure, and sustained vigilance was acknowledged only in quiet reports, medical notes, and occasional letters home, unsigned or addressed vaguely. War, after all, moved faster than the language of its participants. As the season shifted, the northern beaches lay empty once more. Coral reefs glimmered faintly beneath calm waters, the sea as mercurial and unobservant as ever. The hills behind remained scarred with trenches, foxholes, and the ghostly imprints of past skirmishes. Overhead, patrol aircraft traced invisible lines across the sky, their engines humming a constant reminder of continued reach and control. For the first waves of landing men, it was a return to ordinariness, though ordinary in New Guinea meant rain, mud, and the unending green of jungle. The campaign had expanded beyond imagination. From the small, audacious landing of rubber boats, a pattern of amphibious operations now dictated tempo across miles of jungle coast. Convoys moved, infantry advanced, and isolated garrisons disappeared. Yet, despite scale, the memory of that first night silent, dark, absurd remained a touchstone. A few officers and soldiers would carry the image of the coast at 2 a.m. hours, boats gliding through the inky water, surf hissing against unseen reefs, mist blurring the line between possibility and folly. It was proof that surprise, courage, and careful calculation could bend disbelief into action. In the final months of the New Guinea campaign, the sea became a constant ally. Rubber boats, reinforced and standardized, were used to ferry supplies, evacuate the wounded, and probe enemy positions. Their success reshaped Allied thinking, establishing a doctrine of agility over mass and silence over force. The Japanese, faced with an enemy who could arrive where they least expected, adapted too slowly, their defensive networks unraveling in the humid jungle. Each captured ridge, each abandoned village, each silent shore told the story of men who had acted where planning alone seemed insufficient. And yet, amid these operations, the land held its impartiality. Jungle, reef, and tide cared little for victory or strategy. They absorbed the dead, healed the scars, and remained unchanged by human ambition. The final message of the campaign, inscribed not in dispatches, but in mud, rain, and memory, was clear. War on these shores was measured in endurance and cunning as much as in firepower. The rubber boats, once a source of laughter, stood as a symbol of that lesson. Small, fragile, and unassuming, they had carried men into history, altered maps, and turned disbelief into inevitability. The last patrol left the coast quietly, the black shapes of folded boats stacked alongside the remaining supplies. The sea reflected a low, fading sun, and the hills behind stood silent, their trenches hidden beneath vines and mist. Only the memory of movement, the echo of paddles in darkness, and the knowledge that the improbable had succeeded remained. History would record the northern push as a sequence of victories and tactical maneuvers. But for those who had been there, the campaign was also the soundless arrival of men on a quiet coast, the strange audacity of rubber boats, and the enduring reminder that in war, even the smallest gesture can reshape the course of events. The laughter of those who had once mocked the fragile hulls was long gone. In its place, a sober respect persisted, an understanding that courage often wears the guise of absurdity, and that the sea, the jungle, and the night will always judge the daring more fairly than history ever can.